The door closed behind me far too quietly, the sound swallowed by the house I had lived in for 42 years. On the kitchen table sat an envelope with my name typed in a font I didn't recognize, sharp, modern, impersonal. Not handwriting. Not affection. Just efficiency. I set my keys down beside my old blue mug, the one chipped at the rim, and opened it standing up, because something in me already knew I wouldn't want to sit. Inside was a document. Dated March 17. Total assets listed with careful precision, $5,042,000. Then my eyes reached the sentence that stopped my breath mid-chest. The owner may remain on the property only under conditions of appropriate behavior and demonstrated mental stability. I read it twice. Then a third time, slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less cruel. They didn't. At the bottom were 3 signatures. My children's names. Neatly signed. Calm. Final. I stood alone in that kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator loud as a warning siren, and felt something colder than anger move through me. How could they do this to me? If this story touched a nerve, you're not alone. Subscribe to hear stories where silence becomes strength. My name is Margaret Cole, and I learned early that a person can live through a great deal if she keeps her hands steady. I was 19 when I raised my right hand and swore into the U.S. Army. 30 years in uniform taught me how to read a room, how to listen for what isn't being said, and how to carry weight without asking anyone to notice. I served in places where the air tasted like metal and the nights never went dark, and I came home with a body that complained in the cold and a mind that could sort fear from fact. The Army also taught me pride. I was never the loudest voice at the table, but I was the one people looked to when things went sideways. I learned to keep inventories, to plan ahead, to write everything down. If a man promised something, I wanted it in a memo. If an officer gave an order, I wanted it clear and repeatable. You can call that stubbornness if you like. I called it survival. When I retired, I bought this ranch in a remote county of New Mexico, more mesquite than shade, more wind than rain. The first winter the pipes froze and the fence line sagged, and I fixed both with my own hands. I dragged lumber across hard ground, the gravel biting through my jeans, and the smell of creosote from the old fence posts clinging to me for days. I dug post holes until my palms split and bled, then taped them and finished the row. I learned the language of drought and the patience of calving season. I built everything the way I was trained to build in the Army, one dependable choice stacked on another until it stood. My children grew up on this land as if it were a birthright instead of a responsibility. Tom, my oldest, had my stubborn jaw and his father's charm. He could sell a story the way some people sell insurance, smooth, convincing, always with an edge of desperation underneath. He liked big plans and quick turns. When he was a boy, he could talk his way out of chores. As a man, he tried to talk his way out of consequences. Allison was bright and quick with numbers, the kind of girl teachers praised and friends leaned on. She kept her hair neat, her nails short, her voice soft enough to sound reasonable even when she wasn't. She was the one who would bring me a cup of tea and say, "Mom, I'm only worried about you," while her eyes moved over the mail on the counter. Rachel, my youngest, watched everything. Even as a child she measured rooms with her eyes, noticing what people owned and what they feared losing. She didn't throw tantrums, she made lists. She remembered dates. She remembered who said what. She could sit at the table and smile while she quietly counted the silverware. I loved them. I still do, in the way a mother can love people who have made themselves strangers. I fed them, bandaged them, sat up through fevers, drove miles of highway to bring them home when they were scared or reckless. I sat in folding chairs at graduations, clapping until my palms stung, and I took pictures in front of banners that read congratulations as if those letters were proof that everything I sacrificed had landed somewhere good. And when they became adults, I kept helping because that's what I had always done, kept the family moving forward. I paid for tuition. Not once, but 3 times. Tom changed majors, Allison added a second degree, Rachel went private because she said the state school felt small. I helped with their first businesses, a landscaping venture for Tom that lasted 8 months, Allison's bookkeeping service that collapsed after a bad partner, Rachel's real estate license and the costs that came with getting established. I covered debts when the interest started chewing at them. I wrote checks just until you catch up, and I believed their promises because I wanted to. The truth is, they learned my habits the way ranch hands learn a gate latch. They knew I kept money separate for feed, for repairs, for emergencies. They knew I didn't waste, didn't gamble, didn't buy things to impress anyone. To them, that discipline looked like abundance. They began to speak about my work as if it were something that happened naturally, like the land itself had produced it without effort, like it was simply there to be drawn from. For years, I told myself that was normal. Children take. Mothers give. It's the oldest arrangement in the world. But standing in my kitchen with that document in my hands, pride curdled into something bitter. I could taste it, like black coffee left too long on the burner. I realized that the respect I thought I'd earned, through service, through labor, through doing what needed doing, had been quietly replaced by calculation. They hadn't just asked for help. They had studied me. And somewhere along the line, they stopped seeing me as the woman who built a life here, and started seeing me as the life they wanted to own. The first crack didn't come with shouting or anger. It arrived the way rot does in old wood, quietly, from the inside, disguised as something harmless. We were standing by the corral one late afternoon, the sun low and red, dust hanging in the air like it didn't know where to settle. I was counting feed bags, the numbers familiar, comforting. Tom leaned against the fence rail, boots crossed at the ankle, watching me with a half-smile. "Mom," he said, almost laughing, "you're not planning to run all this forever, right?" I laughed too. I remember doing it on purpose, keeping my tone light, because that's what mothers do when they don't want to start a problem. I told him the ranch would keep going as long as someone respected it. He nodded, but his eyes slid away, already disengaged, like he'd gotten what he needed from the question. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. A passing thought. A son imagining the future. Not long after, Allison started stopping by more often. She brought groceries I hadn't asked for, organized drawers that weren't disorganized, commented on paperwork she said she just noticed. One evening she stood beside my desk while I sorted mail and said, gently, "Banking has gotten so complicated lately. I could help you, just to make things easier." I told her I had managed my accounts since before online banking existed. She smiled and said, "Of course. I just worry." Her hand rested on the edge of the desk a moment longer than necessary, close to my statements. "Rachel didn't offer help," she observed. She watched me pay bills, asked what contractors charged, remembered details I hadn't realized I'd shared. When I talked about a repair, she wanted to know the estimate. When I mentioned taxes, she asked who prepared them. Her questions were neat, efficient, filed away. Each moment, by itself, seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Decisions were presented to me already shaped, already agreed upon. Allison began checking her phone whenever I logged into my banking app, as if waiting for confirmation. Tom joked about succession one too many times. One morning I found a bank statement already opened on the counter. The paper smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at numbers I knew by heart, feeling something shift under my feet. That was when anxiety arrived, not sharp, not panicked, but steady. Like a low hum you can't turn off. I began locking drawers. I began checking dates, times, permissions. I noticed new alerts I hadn't set. Small changes, subtle enough to deny, consistent enough to matter. They called it concern. They framed it as help. But control has a texture you recognize once you've lived long enough. It feels smooth at first, reassuring even. Then you try to move, and you realize how narrow the space has become. I understood then that the first crack wasn't in my competence or my memory. It was in the way my children were beginning to look at me. Not as a mother. Not as the woman who built this place, but as something that needed to be managed before it slipped out of their hands. After that, the house changed its habits. Not dramatically, nothing you could point to and name, but in small, accumulating ways that pressed on me day after day. Doors closed more softly than before. Voices lowered when I entered a room. Conversations paused, then resumed only after I'd moved on. It was subtle enough that I could have dismissed it, if I hadn't lived long enough to trust patterns over excuses. They stopped asking what I thought. Things were simply decided. A contractor showed up to inspect the south fence without warning. When I asked who called him, Tom said, "We figured it was time." An insurance policy appeared in my email, already selected, already paid. Allison said, "It just made sense to update it." Rachel added, "Everyone agreed." No one mentioned me. At meals, they spoke over me without raising their voices. They finished my sentences, corrected small details, exchanged quick looks when I mentioned plans that extended too far into the future. Once, I said I was considering expanding the grazing lease next spring. Rachel smiled faintly and said, "That sounds ambitious." The word landed wrong. Ambitious. As if the ranch hadn't been built on ambition and endurance long before she learned to recognize either. I began noticing changes in the accounts. Viewing permissions I hadn't set. Alerts redirected. When I asked, Allison said, "Just safeguards. You don't need to worry about that anymore." The word anymore echoed long after she said it. It carried an assumption that my time of deciding had passed, that my role had shifted without my consent. One afternoon I went to pay bills and found the desk drawer unlocked, papers moved just slightly out of order. Not enough to accuse, enough to unsettle. I put everything back the way I liked it, squared the edges, then locked the drawer and kept the key in my pocket. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. I was still living in my house. I still slept in my bed, walked my land, drank coffee from the same chipped mug each morning. But something essential had changed. My presence felt tolerated rather than central. Like an elderly relative people accommodate while quietly planning around. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. The wind pushed against the windows. The refrigerator clicked on and off. I thought about all the years I had relied on routine to keep me safe, pay the bills, fix what breaks, plan ahead. Now routine felt like something being used against me, a map others were studying to predict my movements. They called what they were doing concern. They said they wanted to reduce my stress, protect me from mistakes, help me transition. But control has a particular shape once you recognize it. It's smooth on the surface, wrapped in polite language and family history, but underneath it presses down, narrowing your choices until you start questioning whether you ever had them. I began to feel smaller in my own life. Not weak, never that, but edged out. Like a piece being moved to the side of the board so the real game could continue without interference. I realized then that this wasn't about love or safety or planning ahead. It was about ownership. About who got to decide what my life looked like from here on out. I was still in my home. But with every quiet decision made without me, every whisper that stopped when I entered the room, I understood something deeply unsettling. I no longer belonged there in the way I once had. And that knowledge settled in me, heavy and unresolved, waiting for whatever would come next. The moment they finally said it out loud came without ceremony. No raised voices. No anger. Just a meeting called like any other, in my own kitchen, at my own table. Allison asked if we could sit down for a minute. Tom closed the door behind him. Rachel placed a folder on the table and squared it carefully with the edge, as if neatness could soften what was coming. The folder was thick. Professional. Heavy in a way paper only gets when someone has paid to make it official. Allison slid it toward me. "We think it's time to put some structure around things," she said. Her tone was calm, practiced. "Just to protect everyone." I opened it slowly. Dates. Account numbers. Asset lists laid out in columns so precise they almost felt clinical. my life, reduced to line items. Land values. Investments. Cash reserves. A total at the bottom I already knew by heart, but seeing it printed like that, summarized by someone else, made my stomach tighten. Then I reached the paragraph they'd come for. The owner may remain on the property only under conditions of appropriate behavior and demonstrated mental stability. For a moment, the room went distant. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the faint tick of the clock over the sink. I read the sentence again, careful, as if it might change if I respected it enough. Appropriate behavior, I said quietly. Tom shifted his weight and crossed his arms. It's standard language, he said. Don't take it personally. Rachel leaned forward slightly. It's just a safeguard, she added. In case something happens. Something happens. Like age itself was a defect waiting to be documented. Allison slid a pen across the table toward me. If you sign, everything stays simple. You keep living here. We help manage things. No stress. And if I don't? I asked. Rachel didn't hesitate. Then we'll have to show you're no longer capable of managing your affairs. There it was. Clean. Direct. No pretense left. I looked at their faces, so familiar, so composed. These were the children I had taught to balance checkbooks, to respect contracts, to stand on their own. Now they were using those same tools to corner me. They weren't yelling. They weren't cruel. They were worse than that. They were reasonable. The humiliation didn't burn. It pressed. It sat on my chest like weight you can't shift. They weren't asking permission. They were offering terms. Framing my compliance as cooperation, my resistance as evidence against me. I thought of every time I had stepped in quietly to fix their mistakes. Every check written without lecture. Every "it's fine, we'll figure it out." I had taught them that calm meant consent. That silence meant agreement. Now they expected it again. All you have to do is sign, Tom said. We can move forward. Move forward. Past me. I picked up the pen and felt its cheap plastic ridges against my fingers. For a moment, I understood exactly what they were counting on: fatigue, habit, a mother's instinct to smooth things over. One signature and the tension would dissolve. One signature and I could go back to pretending this wasn't happening. But something in me refused to bend. I set the pen down. The air shifted immediately. Allison's smile faltered. Tom exhaled sharply through his nose. Rachel's eyes narrowed just enough to tell me she was recalculating. I'm not signing this, I said. Allison leaned forward. Mom, please. You're overthinking. No, I said, calmly. You're underestimating me. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. The wood felt solid beneath my hand, familiar. Mine. They stared at me like I'd broken an unspoken rule. Like I'd stepped out of the role they had already written for me. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about concern or protection or love. It was about control, who held it, and who no longer would. My children hadn't come to help me. They had come to take over. And they were shocked that I refused to disappear quietly. I didn't cry. That surprised me, because I had cried for lesser things: letters from the army, funerals, a sick calf that didn't make it through the night, even a cracked photograph frame after my husband died. But sitting there with that pen waiting like a loaded question, my body went quiet. The heat in my face cooled. My hand stopped trembling. Something inside me clicked into place the way a rifle bolt seats when it's ready. I read the last paragraph again, slowly. The language was careful, almost kind. It spoke of support and safety and shared responsibility. Then it circled back to the same threat: compliance or incompetence. They had built a trap out of soft words, the way you wrap barbed wire in cloth so someone grabs it without seeing the teeth. Allison leaned forward, palms open on the tabletop as if she was offering peace. Mom, please. We're only trying to help. Her eyes flicked to the pen, then back to my face. I noticed her breath was shallow, controlled. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried I might say no. Tom stayed near the window, shoulders stiff, staring at the pasture like it could rescue him from looking at what he'd helped do. When he finally turned, his expression wasn't cruel. That was the worst part. He looked impatient, like I was delaying an appointment. "Just sign it," he said. "We can all move on." Move on. As if this was a formality, a box to tick, not the stripping of my authority in my own kitchen. Rachel didn't speak right away. She watched me the way she always had, quiet, measuring. Then she tapped one fingernail against the folder, a small, rhythmic sound that got under my skin. "If you refuse," she said evenly, "we'll have to take steps. You understand that?" Steps. Like they were discussing a stairwell, not my life. I looked at each of them. I didn't see children. I saw 3 adults who had rehearsed this moment, who had chosen their words and practiced their faces, who had decided I would be managed, contained, corrected. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid of losing access to the ranch, to the accounts, to the future they'd already spent in their minds. A notification chimed from Allison's phone. She silenced it fast, too fast. My eyes caught the glow before it went dark, the corner of a calendar reminder. I didn't read the words, but I understood the shape of it: schedules, appointments, plans made without me, moving forward as if I was already gone. The pen lay near my right hand. I picked it up, feeling the familiar weight, the simple plastic ridges. For a heartbeat I understood how easy it would be to end the tension with one signature. That was what they counted on. Fatigue. Habit. A mother's instinct to smooth things over, to keep the peace even when peace costs too much. I thought of the ranch ledger in my desk drawer, pages worn soft at the corners. I thought of the years I'd balanced feed costs against rainfall, repairs against cattle prices, insurance against the reality of fire season. I thought of every hard choice I'd made while they lived their lives elsewhere, calling only when something was due or failing or falling apart. Then I set the pen down. The silence that followed was thin and sharp. Allison's smile faltered. Tom's jaw tightened. Rachel's eyes narrowed, just slightly, as if she was adjusting her calculations. "I'm not signing," I said. My voice sounded steady, almost neutral. "Not today. Not ever." Allison's mouth opened, closed. "Mom." "No," I said again, not louder, just firmer. "You don't get to place conditions on my existence." I stood, pushing my chair back with a soft scrape. My knees complained, but I didn't let it show. I carried the folder to the edge of the table and left it there, untouched, as if it belonged to someone else. My fingers brushed the wood, and I noticed a faint ring where my mug had sat earlier, a small circle of ordinary life in the middle of something ugly. I walked to the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The boards were warm from sun. The wind smelled of dust and juniper, and somewhere down the drive a gate clicked lightly, swinging on its hinge. I stood there with my hands on the rail, looking out at land that had never lied to me. Land could be harsh, but it was honest. People were the ones who learned to smile while they took. Behind me, the house stayed quiet. I could feel them inside, shifting, waiting, deciding what their next move would be now that mine wasn't obedience. I closed the door behind me, gently, the same way it had closed when I first walked in and found that envelope. And in that moment, with the latch settling into place, I understood something with cold clarity. I wasn't losing my mind. I was losing my place in their story. And for the first time, I stopped trying to earn a seat at a table they'd already cleared for themselves. Not anymore. There was no way back to the family I thought I had. That week I worked the way I always had when a situation turned dangerous. I stopped talking and started documenting. I pulled every statement I could find, printed copies, and slid them into a green binder I'd kept since my army days. The pages felt warm from the printer, still smelling faintly of ink. I wrote dates in the margins. I circled account changes I hadn't approved. I made a list of every helpful access point my children had gained, logins, alerts, shared folders, the phone numbers attached to my accounts. On Thursday morning I drove into town before sunrise. The highway was empty, the ranch fading behind me in the rearview mirror like a place I'd already left. I parked outside a small law office with a hand-painted sign and a flag that snapped in the wind. Inside, the waiting room smelled of lemon polish and old carpet. A receptionist offered me water in a paper cup. I took it, more for the steadiness of holding something than for thirst. The attorney was a woman a few years younger than me with clear eyes and a voice that didn't waste words. She asked for the facts, not the feelings. That suited me. I laid the folder on her desk, the one my children had pushed across my kitchen table, and then I opened my binder beside it. I watched her read. I watched her eyebrows lift once, just slightly, at the sentence about appropriate behavior and demonstrated mental stability. So, she said, looking up, they're trying to condition your right to live on your own property. Yes, I answered. And they're calling it love. She didn't smile. We can fix this. But we do it carefully. Carefully. That was a language I understood. By the end of that first meeting, I had instructions instead of dread. We changed passwords. We removed permissions. We rerouted alerts back to my phone. She drafted letters that would be sent by certified mail, formal, calm, and unignorable. She explained that if anyone tried to use my accounts without authorization, the paper trail would speak louder than family ties. Then we turned to the future. My will had been written years ago, when I still believed my children wanted me well, not managed. It left the ranch and most of the estate divided 3 ways. The attorney asked if that still reflected my intentions. I stared at the old document, the signature at the bottom in my own steady hand, and felt something settle inside me. It wasn't rage. It was recognition. My children had already spent my generosity in their minds. They had tried to shorten my life into a clause. No, I said. It doesn't. We rewrote it. We established a charitable trust with a clear purpose, veterans housing and scholarships for rural kids who didn't have anyone writing checks for them. I chose an independent trustee. I set rules so no one could twist concern into control again. My children would receive a small, fixed amount, enough to say I hadn't abandoned them, not enough to reward what they'd done. The rest would go to people who wouldn't demand my silence as the price of belonging. When I signed the new papers, the pen felt different than the one they'd offered me at my kitchen table. This one didn't ask for surrender. It marked a boundary. Driving home, the sky was wide and pale, the mountains sharp against it. I thought of the ranch gate and the sound it made when it latched, solid, final. I had spent my life maintaining fences. That day, I finally maintained one around myself. I didn't call my children to warn them. I didn't argue. I didn't plead for understanding. I handled it the way I'd handled everything that mattered, quietly, procedurally, and with my name on every line that protected me. The next day I met my banker in an office that smelled of paper. I asked for a written record of every authorized user and every recent change. We opened a new account in my name only and moved the ranch's operating money, feed, repairs, payroll, so nothing could be managed behind my back. I placed holds on large transfers and required my signature in person for any updates, no exceptions. Back home, I changed the locks and reset the gate code. Not because I expected a break-in, but because boundaries have to exist in the real world before they can exist in the heart. I installed a single camera over the barn entrance, accountability, nothing more. That night I made beans and cornbread and sat at my own table with the hum of the refrigerator keeping time. The kitchen looked the same, but it felt different. It felt mine. I wasn't trying to punish my children. I was protecting myself from a kind of control that grows when you keep feeding it. For years I had fed it with favors and money and the belief that love meant access. Now I was ending that arrangement with paperwork and calm. In the morning, I stepped onto the porch with my chipped mug and watched sunlight spread across the pasture. The land didn't ask me to prove my stability. And neither did I. The effects didn't arrive all at once. They came the way financial reality usually does, quietly, then all together. Within 2 weeks, the calls started. First Tom, leaving a message that sounded casual on the surface but rushed underneath. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. Wanted to talk through a few things." He didn't say what things. He didn't have to. Then Allison texted. "Can we meet? There's been some confusion with the accounts." Confusion. As if money simply wandered off on its own. As if access didn't end because I had ended it. Rachel waited the longest. She always did. When she finally called, her voice was precise. "Some partners are asking questions," she said. They were expecting a different financial picture. I imagined spreadsheets adjusted, promises quietly withdrawn, meetings postponed. I imagined doors that had opened easily before now closing just as quietly. Without my name behind them, their plans lost weight. Investors hesitated. Credit tightened. A development Tom had bragged about stalled when financing failed to clear. Allison's business partner asked for documentation she couldn't provide. Rachel's timeline, always so carefully arranged, began slipping. They wanted to explain. They wanted to clarify. They wanted me back in the room, smiling, smoothing things over, reassuring people with my presence. They wanted the version of me that signed checks and stayed silent. I didn't respond. The messages grew longer, then shorter. Frustration edged into politeness. Politeness thinned into urgency. At one point, Tom showed up unannounced, parking at the gate and waiting. I watched from the porch until he left. I didn't wave. This wasn't revenge. I hadn't set out to teach them a lesson. I had simply removed myself from a system that depended on my compliance. What followed was gravity doing its work. I heard later, through mutual acquaintances, that things were tight. That expectations had been misunderstood. No one mentioned me directly, but my absence sat at the center of every explanation. Silence, I learned, can be louder than any argument. And in that quiet, balance began to return, not to them, but to me. Once the noise faded, space opened. Not empty space, but usable space, the kind that lets you breathe without bracing yourself first. The ranch settled into a new rhythm, one that answered only to weather, animals, and my own judgment. Mornings came quietly. I rose before the sun, wrapped my old scarf around my neck, and drank coffee from the same chipped mug, standing on the porch while light moved slowly across the pasture. I stopped feeling watched. No one asked where I was going or why I needed something. The account stayed still. The phone stayed quiet. Peace, I learned, isn't dramatic. It's the absence of pressure. New people entered my life without agenda. A neighbor from 3 miles down the road started bringing over honey from his hives. A woman from the Veterans Center called to ask questions about the trust, her voice careful and grateful. I began volunteering one afternoon a week, helping other veterans fill out forms, untangle benefits, make sense of paperwork that frightened them. It felt familiar, quiet work, necessary work. I made small changes. I hired a ranch hand part-time, someone who respected fences and didn't ask personal questions. I repaired the barn roof instead of postponing it for later. I planted lavender near the porch, the scent rising when the wind passed through, soft and steady. Some evenings I sat at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I was choosing again, how my time was spent, where my energy went. That choice alone felt like a gift I'd forgotten I owned. I wasn't lonely. I was unburdened. For years, fear had disguised itself as responsibility. Love had disguised itself as obligation. Now I could tell the difference. I slept better. My shoulders lowered. Even the land seemed to respond, calves born healthy that spring, fences holding through heavy wind. I stayed where I was, not because I had to prove anything, but because this place still belonged to me, in every sense that mattered. And for the first time in a long while, my life felt balanced, not by others' needs, but by my own quiet consent. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive shouting. It sits down at your table, speaks softly, and tells you it knows better than you do. I spent years believing strength meant endurance, holding everything together, absorbing discomfort so others could move freely. I confused love with access, responsibility with silence. What my children tried to take wasn't only money or land. It was authorship. They wanted to rewrite my life as something finished, something manageable, something they could administer. Saying no meant accepting a quieter truth, that being a mother does not require erasing yourself. I still love them. That didn't vanish with the signatures or the locked accounts. Love can exist without permission. But love does not mean surrendering your voice to keep the peace. I live differently now. I choose carefully. I listen to my instincts the way I once listened to orders, only this time, they come from me. The ranch still creaks at night. The wind still tests the fences. And I am still here, steady, capable, and whole. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength. I didn't lose my family. I found myself.